Today we have a couple of great presenters here for you to talk about our SRE standards for creating safe, respectful, and equitable workplaces. And with that, I'm actually going to kick it off to one of our executive committee members, Sheila Katz, who works at Hillel International and will be sharing a brief overview of the coalition.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, everyone.
Sheila, take it away.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. It's good to see some of your faces and see some of your names printed. I just want to give you a quick overview of what this whole coalition is about, and then I'll introduce your really phenomenal presenters for today, because I know a lot of you have various levels of information about this. Some of you are really inner circle folks, and some of you are just getting involved from an organization already connected. So really at a high level, the coalition is an initiative to ensure safe, respectful, and equitable Jewish workspaces and communal spaces. And this is really inspired by the broader national movements and informed by Jewish values and traditions. And we're really trying to address sexual harassment, sexism, and gender discrimination. And so right now there's 4 key ways that we're operating. And you're going to zoom in to the standards today, but we have our commitment, which is what the organization has to sign on to in order to become a part of the coalition. They're committed to a high level of care around these themes. And then there's the standards, which is kind of our roadmap to how we're getting there that you'll learn about today. We have resources, which you can find on the website. And we have grant making, because we know that this isn't something that costs nothing. That we have to start investing funds into both organizations that can help your organization do better, and perhaps even some of your organizations to get your house in order, to get the right policies in place, to be able to do investigations, things along those lines. So those have become the 4 prime areas. But really as a whole, I want to say that this is meant to be the space for Jewish organizations to come together and push each other to be better. For far too long, people have looked the other way, brushed this under the rug, and we've already lost great talent and great people as a result of not taking a lot of these issues seriously. And we should have probably been doing this years ago, and we're thankful we're doing it now. And anytime you're involved in a coalition, you know it's kind of messy. We're figuring things out as we go along. So I just want to say we're really grateful that you're here today to learn. We're also excited to learn from you as you're trying out new things in your organization. And we're hopeful that if we're all dedicated to doing this work,
taking you wherever you want.
Now more than 60 organizations committed to this, that we'll really be able to shift the culture to allow this important work to happen. So with that, I'm thrilled to actually introduce 2 of the best people on the planet. Dr. Gila Benchmale is a researcher and lecturer who specializes in sexual violence prevention and intervention in religious communities. She's been a senior advisor to the Safety, Respect, Equity Coalition since its inception, and was a key architect of the standards that you're going to be learning about today. And Sharon Masling was the chief of staff to the former EEOC commissioner, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and is actually continuing to work in that space after leaving the EEOC this month, and is also an expert in this space. And so the 2 of them together, like, what a treat to get to learn from them. At the end of all this, we're going to have time for questions, but as we're going through, I just want to invite you to put your questions in the chat box. If you're not seeing it because it's your screen is full, if you just move your mouse, it should say chat on the bottom, and you could chat to everyone. If it feels a little more private, feel free to chat directly to Third Plateau or one of the presenters, and we'll go from there. So thank you again for being here. And with that, Guila and Sharon, I pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Sheila, and thank you everybody for joining today. We're going to go through the purpose and rationale and application of the standards with some more detail that Sharon will cover in a minute. I just want to welcome you into this work, as well as explain that this is part of the first step of becoming involved in the coalition, is listening to this webinar and then taking the information here and hopefully applying it to your workplaces and organizations. And then if you have taken the diagnostic, I say thank you and welcome. And if you have not yet taken the diagnostic, that is the thing you should write down as the to-do after this webinar, is to actually take the diagnostic tool that is on the SRE website. Is that right, Carrie? Yes, that's on the SRE website, which will sort of allow you to take the temperature of where your organization is at today in regards to the standards. And it will also help you see what you have to do and you know, where you need to go. And at the end of this webinar, I'll explain the coalition's plan on helping guide you in that work. And as Sheila said, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. They're being monitored in real time, and then we'll get to the questions at the end of the whole webinar. Okay, Sharon, go ahead.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. It looks like we have close to 50 people, so that's excellent. Just wanted to go over, so the purpose of these standards generally is to prevent and address gender discrimination and sexual harassment in Jewish workplaces. Now, obviously, gender discrimination and sexual harassment are not limited just to workplaces, but these standards are specifically designed to address the harassment that is happening within the Jewish workplaces. Obviously, a lot of what we're talking about will extend to other areas in Jewish communal life as well. The goal generally is to promote safety, respect, and equity overall. We also, want to make sure that all Jewish workplaces are complying with the law. We'll talk a little bit about federal law. I also want to highlight that state laws governing this area, there are a lot of new requirements, especially in California and New York, but there are other requirements in other states as well. So to be sure that you're paying attention to that. And then, of course, the standards, we want to make sure that Jewish workplaces are being both transparent, letting everyone know what is happening and what people are doing in response to harassment or discrimination, and also that we're holding people who've engaged in harassment or discrimination accountable.
And the rationale behind these standards was to incorporate Jewish values, legal obligations, as well as ethical obligations in the realities of Jewish workplaces and communal spaces. So what that means is that often sexual harassment, discrimination, and other forms of victimization are considered to be outside of our world. And we think, well, this is Jewish workplaces, we're part of a religious community and it doesn't happen here, or that it's a separate thing that we, will deal with as having nothing to do with Judaism. But as Sheila said, this is a Jewish coalition, and we are very mindful of embracing the Jewish values that inspire us and actually command us to look out for one another, to treat each other with respect, to recognize that we're all created in the image of God, and to speak up when another person is being harmed. And so these standards are grounded in Jewish values. Additionally, you should know that the standards were vetted by legal experts and experts in employment law. And so we did want to cover legal obligations, but if the legal obligations is what we stick to, then we're going to forget about our ethical obligations as well. And we don't want it to be that the standards are what you can and can't get away with, because we want to raise the bar to say, where as ethical people, we also have other obligations. And so that's why for some people who feel it goes a little too far, you should know that for many, the standards don't go far enough. And that was a delicate balance, which we'll get to later on. And then finally, the standards are also rooted in the realities of Jewish workplaces and communal spaces. So in hearing the voices of people who have been discriminated against, who have been harassed, we took their stories into account in forming these standards.
Okay, in terms of application, so we wanted to make clear that these standards apply to different types of sexual harassment, including physical interactions, verbal or sexual. There are many different types of discrimination and harassment, and the standards were designed to be broad. Includes both in-person interactions and online interactions. Unfortunately, we are seeing more and more harassment that is taking place online, and so the standards apply to both. And we want to make clear that it applies to people of all genders. Not women can be victims of harassment, but they can also be the ones who are engaging in harassment. Men can be the targets. You can have same-sex on same-sex harassment, or male, female, female, male. So transgender, cisgender, it applies to everybody.
And then finally, for people wondering what's the difference between the standards, the policies, and then the additional standards at the end of the actual standards on the SRE website, the standards are really just the first step. They are the broad areas that we are asking workplaces and Jewish communal spaces to start addressing. Policies are the things that you're going to develop in response to each of the standard areas. And then promising practices or additional considerations are really the areas that had originally been in the standards, but they maybe went a little bit too far for everyone. But if you are already, doing really well in some of these areas, here are some other ways that you can ensure that your workplaces are respectful, safe, and equitable. Carly, we're going to go to the next slide. And so thank you. The way that these standards were developed is that we reviewed many existing standards, and here are just some of the ones that were reviewed. We went through those really, really carefully to see how other people are doing this work, to see what we can apply from what they have learned and what they have done. And you are welcome to look up these existing standards as you're starting to do this work, if you want to just see how others have responded. These standards cover many of the areas that we're going to be talking about. And I do want to give a shout out to the consultants who helped put together the standards, including Golly Cooks, Sharon Masling, who's here, Morty Walfish, and Sharon Weiss-Greenberg, as well as everybody else who I spoke to in this development.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking about what is discrimination and what is harassment as we were developing the standards. And in the end, we decided not to include specific definitions within the standards, acknowledging that different organizations are probably going to want to adopt different definitions. But we did at least want to highlight how the EOC defines these terms, kind of as a floor. Our hope is that people will go much deeper than what is and is not legally compliant, but we wanted to at least give you these definitions as a jumping off point. So first of all, discrimination generally, it's unlawful to refuse to hire someone or to discharge someone or discriminate in any way because of that person's sex. And similarly, it is discrimination to deprive someone of employment opportunities or treat them in any other way that adversely affects his or her status because of the individual's sex. So this language comes directly from Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You'll know notice the ellipses. So Title VII obviously prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, national origin, religion, and color, as well as sex. But because these standards are focused on sex-based and gender-based discrimination and harassment, we kept it this way for this slide. So harassment is unwelcome or offensive conduct in the workplace that is based on sex and that is detrimental to an employee's work performance, professional advancement, or mental health. You'll often hear that harassment is either quid pro quo, which is basically saying that someone will be promoted or demoted or get favorable or unfavorable treatment in response for something else, generally sex. It also includes hostile work environment harassment. So the creation of a hostile work environment, even if there is not a direct demand for something in return. So when we talk about sexual harassment, we're really talking about two types of harassment. One are what we call the come-ons. That's what's sexual in nature, when someone either is demanding sex in exchange for something, quid pro quo, or just someone who is constantly asking someone out on a date, or someone who is touching somebody inappropriately. Anything that is sexual in nature constitutes sexual harassment. But sexual harassment or gender-based harassment also includes the put-downs that are sex-based, based on a person's gender, but not necessarily sexual in nature. So comments that, women just can't do certain jobs, or displays of pornography, or use of foul language to describe men or women, discussions about someone's sexual orientation in a harassing form. All of those may not be sexual in nature, but they're still sex-based harassment because they are put downs on the basis of sex. Next slide, please.
So the first area of the standards talks about leadership and accountability. And the reason why it's the first area is because without having your leadership sign on to this effort and actually be models of that effort and see this as a very necessary part of their workplace, you really cannot do the other areas. You can't have training if your leadership doesn't believe that this training is of the utmost importance. And we also want to make sure that leaders are themselves accountable, as well as believe in holding those that work for them accountable around safety and equity and respect. And because we're dealing with many different types of Jewish organizations and institutions and workplaces, we wanted the word leadership to be as broad as possible. And therefore, we're talking here about senior management, whether they are paid or non-paid, as well as clergy, as well as boards who are sometimes or often the decision makers in Jewish workplaces. And leaders need to know that they are both legally and ethically obligated to prevent and address discrimination and harassment. And one thing I will say is that in writing these standards and in doing the work that I do, oftentimes I'll be told by leaders that, that we're very, very good about dealing with harassment. And then an example will be raised and they'll say, oh, that's not our responsibility. When in fact, legally, they are obligated to respond to the harassment of one of their employees, even if it didn't happen on their work site. So it's important that you are aware of federal, and as Sharon has said before, state laws. How do you ensure accountability, and how do you ensure that you as a leader or that your leadership is signed on? The first is to communicate the importance of a diverse and inclusive workplace that is free of both discrimination and harassment, as well as to state the values and model the behaviors that you are asking of others. So how can we ask of others what we aren't doing ourselves? Ensuring that time, money, and other resources are allocated for this effort. So in your budget, is there a line allocated towards money, time, and the hiring of people to help towards this effort? And as I said before, are you aware and upholding the relevant laws? Next slide, please, Carly.
Okay, so the second part of the standard talks about policies and guidelines and says that every organization should have both non-discrimination policies and anti-harassment policies. So the non-discrimination policy prohibits broad-based gender discrimination. So anything about the terms, conditions, or privileges of employment. And that can include not hiring someone because of his or her gender, not promoting them, disparities in pay, differences in evaluations. Every organization should have a policy that prohibits discrimination. But then specifically, the standards encourage everyone to have an anti-harassment policy that prohibits sexual harassment by or of an employee that occurs within the work context, whether on or off the workplace site. So as Guila just mentioned, it's very clear that when harassment happens in the workplace, an organization has a responsibility to stop that. But when we're talking about anti-harassment policies, we're also talking about anything that is work-related. So it may be attending a conference, it may be attending training. In any instance where an individual is doing something work-related, that person should be protected from harassment. And similarly, I want to underscore that a workplace has to prohibit sexual harassment and protect employees from harassment, even if it's not being done by another employee in the organization. So if an employee is being harassed by a congregant or by a donor, the workplace still has an obligation to protect that individual from harassment. Some of the things that should be included in the policies include, first of all, that it's not just limited to legally actionable behavior. So we want to get at misconduct before it rises to the level of something that is illegal. It is much easier to address an instance of harassment when it is a low-level behavior, an off-color joke, let's say, rather than something that is severe or pervasive, which is the legal standard. So we hope that all your anti-harassment policies, as they define what conduct is not acceptable, include conduct that may not rise to the level of illegal conduct, but still should not be okay in the workplace. We say that policies should empower targets and witnesses to report. So if you have been both the victim of harassment or if you have observed harassment happening, the policy should empower individuals to come forward. And there should be strong complaint procedures where if someone does come forward, the response they receive is, thank you. Thank you for telling us what is happening. The policy should empower bystanders to intervene. A lot of people are scared to intervene in the moment, sometimes because they don't know what to do, but often because they are scared they're going to be retaliated against. So the policies should make clear that bystander intervention is welcome. And then finally, the policies need to prohibit retaliation. If someone comes forward to complain about an instance of harassment, that person should be welcomed, should be respected, should not be retaliated against. Next slide, please.
So the third area of the standards is the reporting and response procedures to ensure that you have them. These are actually a continuation of the policies that Sharon just talked about. In other words, you should ensure that your policy includes a reporting and response procedures for reporting discrimination and harassment. There should be impartial procedures for reporting complaints, for tracking those complaints and making sure that you can monitor, is there a pattern here? What's happening? You know, is there a breakdown in some of our systems? As well as investigating the complaints and then responding to those complaints. So you have to make sure that all four of those areas that you have policies in advance. And I say in advance because what's important to know is that instead of reacting to things as they arise, that's the time where our biased and cloudy thinking and cognitive dissonance comes into play and we're not able to make the proper decisions. But if you have a system, a reporting and response system, before anything arises, then as it comes up, you know what you have to do, and that clouded thinking sort of is taken away from you. And survivors have actually talked about institutions that had, you know, systems in advance for reporting and responding, and that they were followed no matter who it was that was committing these behaviors, versus institutions that just acted reactively and did not make the appropriate decisions. All complainants should be treated seriously, respectfully, and urgently. So you shouldn't just brush something away if somebody discloses that something happened. The person who is coming forward should be treated respectfully, and things should be dealt with urgently. It shouldn't go on a to-do later list. If you have a person who's intaking those complaints, then they should be dealt with right away. As well, the process should be communicated and disseminated regularly and be accessible. So all the employees should be made aware of the process for reporting, of how their reports are going to be tracked, of how a report will be investigated, as well as the response procedures that will be followed. There should be a proportionate and consistent corrective action imposed when harassment or discrimination has been found to have occurred. So those two words, proportionate and consistent, are really, really important. Not every investigation that finds harassment will end in termination, nor must it. That is one type of response. But like Sharon mentioned before, if somebody makes an off-color joke or they make them a few times, you know, there may be some coaching that is needed in order to guide the person along and recognize that this is not the right type of joke to be telling in this workplace. The word consistent in that bottom line there, consistent corrective action, is that all people found engaging in the same behavior should have the same consequence. So this way, it's not that one person gets treated a certain way because of their status or because of their place in the organization, but that everybody who acts in the same way will be treated in the same way. Just to follow up on what Sharon said about welcoming complaints, that should be part of this reporting and response procedure as well. You should thank people for coming forward. Jennifer Freed, who is a researcher on institutional betrayal, which is actually what often happens when harassment occurs in religious institutions, she says we must cherish the whistleblower. And that's a really important part of our culture here. Are we afraid to do this work, or are we welcoming of the stories that can help us rectify the situation and ensure a stronger workplace?
Education and training. So one of the key issues when it comes to preventing harassment is making sure that all employees are trained about what harassment is and how to prevent it. So every employee should receive training, no matter if it's the lowest person on the totem pole or the highest. The training should be about harassment, yes, but also discrimination, prevention, and then a lot of what Guila was just describing, what happens in terms of how to intervene and what is the response if you report that harassment has occurred. The training should be about all policies and procedures. There's been a lot of discussion that until recently, a lot of the anti-harassment training that people were receiving was not particularly effective. So we make clear that the training should be comprehensive. It should be interactive, so it's not just sitting in front of a computer-based program and just clicking to the next button. People should have a chance to engage, to ask questions, to role play. It should be properly resourced, and the trainers need to be qualified and know what they're doing. The standards say that the required training is called legal compliance. So what is required, or what does or does not constitute illegal behavior in the workplace. However, when we get to best practices, we'll talk about some of the other types of training that are available that go way beyond legal compliance and certainly have been shown to be as effective, if not more effective, than training. Okay, next slide, please.
So what you're seeing in the standards now is the bottom line where we want everyone to start from. But we're hoping that as you get into this work, you too will start to recognize that there really is a lot farther that we can go. And originally the standards was like 10 to 15 pages. And so it had a lot more in it that we ended up taking out, and we hope to move you along. At some point, hopefully all Jewish workplaces will have the highest level of standards. And so these are some of the things that we took out of the bottom line, but we're hoping that wherever you are, you will eventually as well be able to consider implementing some of these standards into your workplaces.
Okay, so the first standard that we highlight here are other forms of discrimination and harassment. So as I alluded to earlier, the EOC Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act prohibits not just gender discrimination and harassment, but also discrimination and harassment on the basis of race, national origin, age, and color. There's then the ADA, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability, and the ADEA, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of age. So we hope that as organizations are looking at their policies and procedures regarding discrimination and harassment, that they not just limit it to gender discrimination and harassment. That's critically important to address, but there are other types of discrimination and harassment that also should be addressed.
And then the next one on accepting and granting funds, this really, the title there should be corrected. So I'm just going to read it out and explain. Here we're talking about reevaluating the relationships to affiliated individuals who have been found to have engaged in discrimination, harassment, or assault, And the reevaluation should include reconsidering the usage of their funds or services that they've provided to the organization. So if somebody has found to have harassed or discriminated or otherwise victimized, and you have a relationship with that person, whether they give you funds or whether you grant them funds or whether they give you their time as a volunteer or as an employee, you should reevaluate your relationship with that person. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to give back their funding, because I'd like to acknowledge the difficulty that that would pose on some organizations, but it does mean to have a serious discussion with your leadership and with everybody in your workplace around what does that mean to have happened, and perhaps are there other ways that we could be using this money? Do we involve the survivors in those decisions? And this is a larger conversation to have. It's not only around money, it's also around people who have given you their time or their expertise. How do you consider working, continuing to work with or in conjunction with this person? And how do you deal with that? It has to be a discussion. It shouldn't be just a, you know, we're going to continue on as is.
Okay, the next standard that we would encourage organizations to consider is creating a policy around parental leave. So when we're talking about gender equity, one of the issues is parental leave that should be applying equally to all parents. So regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation, marital status, whether you're fostering or adopting, we encourage every organization to establish a set number of weeks that individuals are entitled to have time off to bond with their new children. We also then recommend that there be medical leave related to pregnancy, delivery, and recovery. So traditionally, a lot of women have just been given maternity leave and have lumped both the caregiving piece and the medical recovery piece into the same leave. And then fathers, adopters, or just second partner have not gotten any leave at all. So again, the goal is to establish both parental leave for any new caregiver, as well as medical leave for any women who have delivered a new child.
The next standard that we want you to consider is having a policy that addresses romantic relationships and abuses of power in Jewish workplaces. As we were writing these standards, one of the things that came up a lot was that people meet their mate in Jewish workplaces. And I even attended a conference once where so many people were wearing a t-shirt that said, "I met my spouse here." We can talk about that later, but we just want to acknowledge that there may be an abuse of power happening if a supervisor is dating their supervisee, if the relationship goes sour, you know, things can arise there. So there should be a policy that addresses these romantic relationships. For example, that the couple would have to inform HR and know that one of them may be moved to a different position so that one is not overseeing the other's position. So to consider having a policy that addresses the idea of supervisors dating their supervisees.
Okay, sharing of information. This is another area that we encourage people to consider. So one, as if you recall, Guila had talked about accountability and holding people accountable for the misconduct that they have engaged in. So we say that here that targets of harassment or discrimination should be informed of any disciplinary measures that have been taken. Because too often people will file complaints, there will be an investigation, they will find that discrimination or harassment has occurred. The organization will actually take some sort of corrective action, but never tell the individual what transpired. So that individual feels like there was never any action and that his or her complaint was a complete waste of time and doesn't trust leadership anymore. So even though the organization has done everything right in terms of holding the individual accountable, without sharing that information to the complainant, that complainant does not feel whole. There may be a sense in the organization generally that complaints are not taken seriously. So we strongly encourage organizations to let the complainant know what happened, that there was a finding of discrimination or harassment, and if corrective action occurred, what that was.
And we also want to consider ask you to consider that there should be a process for protecting other Jewish workplaces when providing referrals for an employee who was found to have discriminated, harassed, or engaged in prohibited behaviors. This is because what often happens is that someone is let go because of this, but then there is no problem for them to find another job and other targets in that workplace. Because when someone calls about a referral, we, by omission perhaps, or even sometimes outright lying, don't say exactly what happened, why they were let go or why they left. This is a very Jewish value of not standing idly by, right? To ensure that we can protect other people. You obviously have to know what you are and are not allowed to say legally, but how is it that we can protect other Jewish organizations so that we can break the cycle of harassment? Additionally, if we want to be, forward about this across the Jewish professional landscape, we would love to see an annual compilation of discrimination and harassment incident data that could be made publicly available in an anonymous aggregated report. So can we show in a year from now, how many incidents of discrimination and harassment came up in Jewish workplaces? How many investigations were conducted? How many institutions acted with a response and followed up on that? Can we show that there has been movement around the standards in a year from now?
Okay, and then lastly, we wanted to talk about training. As I mentioned earlier, the standards say as a minimum you should provide compliance training. So what behavior is and is not acceptable in the workplace, and what to do if you have experienced harassment or discrimination or observed harassment and discrimination. That's the floor, that's the bare minimum. But we have found that there is additional training that actually has shown to have much more of an impact on reducing the level of harassment and discrimination in the workplace. First, there's training that helps leaders identify and assess risks. The EOC found in its report that there are certain types of risk factors that will make a workplace more conducive to harassment. And so having leaders look at what those risks are and think proactively about how to address them is really important. Secondly, we talk about bystander intervention training. So as I mentioned earlier, some people want to intervene when they observe harassment or discrimination, but they just don't know what to do. So bystander intervention training provides people with the skills they need. It gives them a range of options of different types of ways that they could intervene. Anything from being really direct and saying, hey, cut that out, to saying to a person after the fact, how did that make you feel? Did it make you feel uncomfortable? Would you like to go to HR, and do you want me to come with you? So there are a whole range of behaviors that people can learn that may not come naturally to them, but once taught, people become more active bystanders and can stop a lot of harassing conduct before it becomes a bigger issue. We also encourage organizations to provide respectable workplace training or civility training, which is not focused on protected classes and is much more focused on how to create a culture of respect in the workplace, how people can treat each other respectfully, how to provide feedback if something is just bothering you and treating you the wrong way, and how to receive that feedback. And finally, we encourage people to think about training on unconscious bias. We all have unconscious biases, and so by learning about what those may be and checking yourself, it may stop a lot of behaviors that you may not even realize you're engaging in. So all these trainings are different ways of getting at the issues regarding harassment and discrimination, and have shown to have a lot of promise. Next slide, please.
So that's basically the overview of the standards. If you're asking what's next, or oh my gosh, this was so much information, we agree with you, it is a lot. And each area could have its own webinar, which we are talking about how to help you, guide you along in each of the specific areas. I know Carrie wrote something on the chat about when the diagnostic will be rolled out. So if you are already part of the SRE, you will have received it and hopefully taken it. If not, please do so. If you are not yet part of the SRE, once you sign the commitments and are in touch with us, you will receive a link to the diagnostic so that you can take that and start the process. The other thing that will happen after you take the diagnostic is that you will receive information about a call with myself or somebody from Third Plateau around somebody from SRE around, what were the results of your diagnostic and how you feel about that and where it is that you need to go. And that will just also help you to be accountable to SRE and SRE accountable to you, that being part of the coalition actually means something, that it means that you're going to implement the standards, that it means that you're going to do your best to actually take these 4 areas and hopefully the additional considerations and create change in your workplace. You will also receive the playbook, which is still being formulated, or questions under each of these 4 areas. So what we've done is we've taken questions that you need to have and conversations that you need to have around what it looks like to implement the leadership and accountability standards. What does it look like to implement the policies and procedures, et cetera? And those are really important questions to help you create the policies that go in each of the 4 standard areas. We encourage you to check out the resources on the SRE website, including the expert consultants. You do not have to wait for your intake call to do this work. You can start doing it today. You can make an appointment with a consultant and have them help you implement the standards. You can look at the resources and say, okay, where is it that we're doing well and where do we need to go? You can review the documents that were used to create these standards that are listed on slide 4, and they are also in the website. So they are all publicly available and you can just look them up. I highly encourage you to look at the EEOC report as well as their checklists. That will really, really help you along in how to actually implement this standards. Sharon, you want to talk about the last 2 things?
Sure. So a lot of people sometimes will ask me, I don't know what to do with harassment. It's a whole new area for me. And what we've been encouraging people is just to think about this as a management issue. If you had a safety issue in your workplace, you would address it that way. If someone came to you with a complaint about something that's not harassment related, you would generally know how to handle it. And if you didn't, you would know where to go to get the advice that you need in terms of how to handle it. So if you have harassment happening in your workplace, there are resources out there, as Guila just said, often just standard, about finding out what happened, coaching the individual about the misconduct and how not to engage in that misconduct in the future. Corrective action, discipline. If someone has been engaging in misconduct, how would you do that in another context? It's probably the same type of corrective action. So think about this as a management issue and it will help you figure out how to respond to different types of harassment. And then finally, talk to your peers. Everybody, we are all in a moment right now. We are all grappling with these issues. Lots of Jewish organizations have really been trying to figure out what to do, what do they need. Share your knowledge, share your resources. Don't be scared to pick up the phone. And it's a work in progress. And so I just encourage everyone, as Guila said, we're a coalition. Let's keep talking to each other. And I think that's the end of the presentation, but we have time for a few questions if there are any.
Great, thank you so much, Guila and Sharon. We do have a few questions actually already in the chat, but I'm gonna start it out actually by passing the mic over to my colleague, Carrie, who can chime in with a little bit more detail about the rollout of our diagnostic.
Thanks, Carly. And Guila and Sharon, thank you so much. This has been very helpful and I think provides people with just a little bit more detail on how they should be thinking internally about this. So I wanted to jump in. I know we covered this a little bit on the chat, but clarifying around the diagnostic. The diagnostic to date has been rolled out to the 60 or so organizations who are part of the leadership of SRE. the rest of you who have adopted the commitment, we will be sending out a link to the diagnostic shortly. You have not missed an email. We wanted to make sure that that we had the leadership kind of taking it and testing it, and before we rolled it out more broadly. So that will be coming in the next couple of weeks, and certainly those of you who have already adopted the commitment and been in touch with us, you will be receiving that in an email. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit about the diagnostic.
Great, thank you, Carrie. One more question that I got via chat that I want to raise up. Someone was wondering a little bit about now position is focused on gender and sexuality-based discrimination, and sort of how we see the piece around race, disability, other forms of discrimination, which you briefly addressed, Sharon, playing into this work. So if you can just expand on that a little bit.
Sure, I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but I think there was a decision when the Safety, Respect, and Equity Coalition was first being formed to focus on gender-based discrimination and harassment. And as we've dug into the issues more deeply, we realize that the policies and the procedures and the training that organizations are going to implement around gender-based discrimination and harassment will have an impact on other types of harassment and discrimination as well. So rather than just cordoning off gender and sex-based harassment and limiting your activities to that type of discrimination and harassment, we are encouraging people to think more broadly that we don't want any type of discrimination or harassment happening in a Jewish organization, be it disability-based or racially based or national origin-based. So as you're thinking about what do you do to prevent this type of misconduct from happening in the first place, because I think a huge goal of the standards is prevention. What do you do so that you do not have this misconduct in your workplace? To think not only about gender-based misconduct, but other types of misconduct as well. Does that answer the question?
Could I say something? I think it's really important, Sharon, that you added that, because I was at a workshop this morning talking about Jews of color, discrimination between and among Jews and Jews of color, and it was thoughtful. It was clear there was a lot more work that was needed. But it occurred to me that, like, this is being given, these messages are being given to the same people who are also beginning to grapple with gender and harassment issues. And it's important that the people who are doing the training, and sometimes the funders who are funding both of these efforts, urge people to talk about them together. So actually, when you showed the very first slide, and you said we put in the ellipsis because we're only talking about gender, I was actually going to write you and say, leave everything in, and then say, this is focused on gender, but this is the rule against discrimination.
Right. And
it comes up, and by the way, racial issues, for example, come up also both in the form of discrimination and in the forms of harassment, very much as you were talking about earlier.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I was going to add, we can't separate the issue of victimization from these other isms, from ableism and racism and all of the other isms and sexual orientation. If you speak to survivors of various groups, they will tell you how being LGBTQ impacted the fact that they were victimized, or being of a certain race or ethnic origin impacted their ability to disclose. It's all about who is being heard, who is able to come forward, who is able to be a whistleblower, whose stories do we believe, who is legitimized as a victim. And so it's not that there's just forms of discrimination and forms of harassment, but how they intersect. However, I will say from the SRE's position, the SRE was formed directly in response to Me Too, and I think there was this fear that if we bite off so much, we're not going to be able to accomplish anything. So they wanted to begin with gender and sex. However, definitely we are not only looking at it through that lens, and it is important to show how all of these different forms of oppression intersect.
But I think it would really be good if there was, like, I would leave the discrimination clause in, and I would put an introductory paragraph that say these are all issues. They intersect at the workplace. People are may have to get different kinds of training. SRE is doing a lot of training on this, but many of these things overlap and they define a workplace. And so eventually the workplaces that are on this call and that SRE is talking to are also workplaces that are going to be dealing with these other issues. I think it's actually a great opportunity to sort of say, you know, it's what people are calling intersectionality, which is a very big word. But to say, like, these are real things, and if you're in charge of a workplace, these are all issues that you need to be thinking about. And this is particular training on one. There's training offered on lots of others, but this should just all be in your mind. And don't be overwhelmed by it, because you can find ways to work on it connectedly, but it's important to every workplace.
Great. Thank you, Ruth, Gila, and Sharon. We have a few more questions, and I want to make sure that we get to them. Sure. Since we only have about 7 minutes left. So one more question, Gila and Sharon, I think one of you should be able to help with this. Regarding that interagency sharing of information, particularly when someone has been terminated due to harassment issues, we've got a question asking, how can you share that information with another organization without running into privacy issues, character assassination risk, or opening yourself up to legal liability?
Right. I'll start, and then Gila, you can chime in. This is a huge issue that we hear from especially HR personnel all the time. And so people are scared of defamation suits, of warring against privacy laws. You have to be confident that the reason you terminated an individual, for all sorts of reasons, you have to be confident in your decision. But if something is true, it's not defamation. So it's not character assassination if the person engaged in the misconduct. So, there are concerns about if someone has engaged in harassment or discrimination, generally, is that person unemployable for the rest of his or her life? And that is a bigger concern, and something that I think everyone in this movement is grappling with right now. But in terms of giving a professional reference, if the organization is quite convinced, based on the evidence and a thorough investigation, that the person engaged in misconduct, then they are absolutely in their right to share that information with a potential new employer.
I mean, I will also add that I think it depends as well as on the job the person is applying for. So I think that context is important as well. Around where that person is heading and how that impacts the people in that workplace.
Great, thank you. We've got one more question in here.
Can you offer some clarification about how, in concrete terms, we should think about the phrase individuals who have been found to have engaged in discrimination, harassment, or assault? What are some ways to think about due process and/or level of proof in this context?
Okay, well, that goes back to Gila's point about you want to have your policies and procedures in place ahead of time. So you do not want to be creating them on the fly. Often an organization should probably consult with counsel about how they want to set up their policies and procedures. There are also a ton of resources online that you can look at. You want to think about what sorts of corrective action you will engage in. Again, the same way you have corrective action if someone stole money, if someone missed a deadline, you know what the discipline is going to be for that type of misconduct. If someone has engaged in harassment or discrimination, you should be thinking ahead of time, what type of corrective action do you want for that type of misconduct? And again, it's a continuum. The key issues are that there is a response and that the response is consistent regardless of who the perpetrator is.
So Sharon, I think this question was in regards to the additional standards. So either reconsidering relationships with those who have been found to have engaged in discrimination.
Okay. I apologize.
So how high does the standard of proof / due process have to be for reconsidering relationships? And I will say that this standard was created in response to some of the very public stories about harassers or those who have been classified as harassers in the media, where several victims have come forward talking about their experiences. So Sharon, would you change would there be any change to what you said around the, you know, found to have engaged in?
I think this is just a tough issue. I think, you know, this is not a criminal process. So we're not talking about evidentiary standards. It's not a legal process. So again, I think organizations should be thinking ahead of time about how do they want to deal with donors who may have, you know, engaged in conduct and what they want the level of proof to be. Again, I would, especially on this issue, it's not a legal question, and it's much more how workplaces want to reevaluate their relationships.
And I think you should also be aware that your stakeholders are looking at how you respond. So I was recently on a panel, and in that panel, somebody spoke about the leadership of that organization that hosted the panel and said, why is a certain person's name on your buildings? And so if you're not engaging in those discussions on your own or in advance, your stakeholders might force you to do that. And you want to know how you're going to respond to them. You need to have a process for how you're dealing with these things because you're going to be asked about it.
All right, great. Thank you so much. So that actually works out perfectly. That is all of the questions that we had in our chat and also all of the time that we have. So I think with that, I want to say another huge thank you to all of you for joining us and let you all go right on time. So thank you all so much. And if you have any further questions about the coalition's work, you can submit the contact form on our website or email us coalition@safetyrespectequity.org. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.